I hope you enjoyed the film. We're going to transition into our panel discussion now. We're happy to have a handful of experts here on hand tonight to expand further on these issues, as well as two Georgetown students who will add a little millennial perspective to the issues. So if the panelists want to come up, I will see if you can go.
Hello. Sure.
Help yourself to pizza and drinks as well.
Hey, good again. How are you?
This will start in the table. Ryan Berg is a senior at Georgetown University. He's from Heartland, Wisconsin. He's majoring here at Georgetown in government and theology. Ryan worked on Capitol Hill for Congressman Paul Ryan and for the U.S. Department of Labor, and also for Americans for Tax Reform. Stefan Berg-Kruger serves as the Youth Outreach Coordinator at the Concord Coalition. Stefan's responsible for building working relationships and finding opportunities to collaborate with young people from around the country. He graduated from the University of Pennsylvania with a BA in philosophy, politics, and economics. And he spent time as a freelance web developer before joining Concord Coalition in the fall of 2007. Ed Lorenzen is a 1992 graduate of American University, which he calls the Georgetown of Upper Northwest. He worked for Congressman Charlie Stenholm of Texas from 1990 to 2004 and worked from the Concord Coalition after he was defeated. Ed returned to Capitol Hill as a senior policy advisor for House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer of Maryland when Democrats gained the majority in 2007. He worked with Charlie Stenholm. He was responsible for the congressman's work as part of the Blue Dog Coalition, including drafting Blue Dog budgets from 1995 to 2004. As a policy advisor to Leader Hoyer, Ed advises him on all fiscal and economic issues, and he's responsible for working with the Budget Committee to ensure all legislation still for consideration complies with House pay-go rules, and that's how he got the nickname Captain Pay-Go. Great to have you here with us this evening. Donald Marin is a visiting professor at the Georgetown Public Policy Institute. He teaches microeconomics and public finance. From 2002 to 2009, he served in various senior White House positions and in Congress, including as a member of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, acting director of the Congressional Budget Office, and executive director of Congress's Joint Economic Analysis, some of the best acronyms in Washington, D.C. He has a PhD in economics from MIT and a BA in mathematics from Harvard. And lastly, but not least, Scott Sturrett. He's from the class of 2013 from Nova Scotia, interested in international affairs. He's an active member of the Georgetown University College Democrats, Connectivity Commission, and International Relations Club. So it's great to have you all here tonight, and all the folks here and online. And I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Ryan Sheneke, who's a recent American University alumni and also co-founder of WeCan'tPayThatTab.org. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks for having everyone here today. I guess we were watching that video that was made back in 2008. I think the debt was at 53 trillion, and now I think we're looking at something like 72, 73. So in 2 years, you can see that we've jumped up a large amount. So it is a big problem. I'm glad you all came out here today. I'm glad you helped us. So I think with tax day, why don't we start with taxes and addressing some tax issues. We know that taxes could go to about 50% or so if we don't do anything. And so I thought we'd just start off by talking about maybe what are the alternatives. A lot of people are talking about, redoing the tax code reform, value-added tax. I think Congress just voted down, the Senate just voted today to not do any value-added tax measures. So I think that just recently passed. So I don't know who wants to start off, maybe talking about tax.
I'll talk about that. What I'm saying is we're not supposed to censor the Senate. After the Senate isn't censored, I don't pay much attention to it. But it was disappointing, not because I'm necessarily advocating that, but the president has proposed a commission. I think we will obviously talk about that more this evening. A commission on fiscal responsibility and reform that is intended to be able to look at the entire fiscal picture, and I think everyone who's talked about needs really dealing with these long-term problems starts with the premise that everything needs to be on the table, and that some version of a bad or people also talk about a progressive consumption tax, is one of the things that the Commission is going to be talking about. And not to, I don't want to prejudge what the Commission is going to do or advocate it, but it was disappointing that the Senate voted to say one of the things that the Commission was going to be talking about, one thing so a lot of experts have suggested is something that should be considered, both for fiscal reasons, for revenue source, and as well as for other economic reasons, it may be a way to encourage more savings as opposed to consumption, is being rejected. And I think it was a bad message. That's not to say it's obviously binding, but I think more broadly on the issue of taxes, that it comes down to the question of we need to figure out how to pay for what we buy, and that you need to look at both sides of it, and that as society is getting older, we need to decide how much of the promises that we've made to future retirees do we want to keep, and that we have more people that inherit it, there's going to be a greater cost in meeting those commitments, and we're going to have a lot of other obligations, and so we need to look at what are the commitments we really want to make, what are the things we really want government need to do, and then figure out what is the most efficient and effective way to collect the revenues to do that. I think too often we sort of start with, let's just figure out what we want to do on the tax side and in the tax code, and then without really putting the two together. There clearly are ways to look at reforms to make the tax code simpler, and I think one of the things that the Fiscal Commission could do, at least on the corporate tax side, if not on the income tax side, is looking at simplifying the code, getting rid of a lot of the various tax preferences and rates, and having somewhat lower rates. And ideally, you could do it where you have rates not, you're putting a little bit more revenues, that you bring rates, part of the money you save by closing some preferences goes to paying the lower rates, and part of it is going to bring in more revenues. I think that is also the kind of thing to look at. But I do think that although the bigger source of the problem is on the spending side, but we do need to look at what these commitments will be, and we'll need to find ways to bring in more revenues.
Yeah, so when you're talking about, looking at, talking about closing sort of the loopholes in the tax code, the offshore sort of...
There's offshore stuff, but then I think if we're talking about a more comprehensive corporate tax reform, there are a lot of various accounting rules and other preferences that if corporate rates are high, corporations wouldn't consider them loopholes, they would consider them reasonable part of their business practice. But you could make some of those changes in those preferences.
I think Forbes just ran an article recently that Exxon Mobil, they paid no taxes last year because of all their subsidiaries are overseas. So, anybody else really want to add?
I'd echo a lot of what Ed said, that the first order doesn't decide how big a government we want the government to do, and then figure out how to finance it and bring the lines together so we're paying for what we spend. It seems implausible, given what the federal government has committed to thus far, that they're going to be able to do it entirely by slowing the growth of spending. It seems implausible that we'll be able to grow our way out of this, and so at some point there's going to be this great debate about how to raise more revenue. And I think, as I'd say, kind of first order of business is to look at our existing tax code, and I would say both on the corporate side and on the individual side, where there's much more money, and say, wow, before we start raising rates, let's look at all the various exclusions and preferences and special things in there, and then maybe we can broaden the tax base rather than before we start raising rates, and we can do things on that front. The VAT, if you look around the developed economies of the world, there's something called the O.E.C.D, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's basically the developed economies of the world club. It has 30 members at the moment. 29 of them have a VAT. One does not. U.S. is an outlier. And my reading of that is that, as pressures grow, as our size of our government grows, there's kind of a historical international trend that eventually you adopted that because there are reasons to think it's a more efficient, less painful way to raise tax revenues than the alternatives. And then being a relatively green guy myself, I also am constantly advocating for, if we're going to do anything on climate change, we ought to seriously consider something that would kill two birds with one stone and do a carbon tax or do a trade deployment system where we auction the balances so that we're both addressing climate change and bringing in so much income.
When you talk about climate change, so you're talking about using the revenues from sort of a cap and trade system or something to...
Right. Rather than recycling it to people, or rather than spending it on various programs, which was the first impulse of everyone in Congress, is to raise the money and then spend it, to actually say, based on the charts we just saw, and all of those charts are scarier today, as you said, than they were when this movie was made, basically the taxpayer ought to have a seat at the table saying, hey, you know, some of that money might be useful for these big challenges.
Right, but speaking specifically on that, when I had some of the early meetings on climate change that the committees were working on, and they had far more ways, even though the cap and trade was going to be bringing in over $1 trillion, they had far more ways to spend that money than they did, you know, revenues that would be raised. And actually I won't get into it, but there's something called the 25% rule. If you lose some revenues, and they hadn't accounted for that, so they overspent money, and they hadn't even thought about the fact that they were reducing it. But we end up having a cap and trade, but then giving so much back to the industry and consumers, not raising it. But I think that's the other logical place, the obvious place for people to be looking. And I do think that if we, going forward with our current fiscal situation, if we would look at something like, whether it be cap and trade, or I think a carbon tax is probably a more straightforward way of accomplishing very similar objectives, that a good portion of that is going to go direction.
And what about the critics of sort of that it's a regressive tax? You know, that's really taxes the poor more than taxes the wealthy, because you're taxing them with the goods.
Well, so I mean, it is. It's clearly less progressive, right? You can have a debate about whether it crosses the line to being regressive. Depends how you think about consumption. But yeah, it's a much less progressive tax than the income tax system we have. Again, if you do international comparisons, what you discover is that as the size of government grows, what governments and society seem to choose is to have less progressive tax systems. That basically it's the only way it appears if you look across countries and figure, you know, assume that they've been trying to figure out the best way to do this. It seems to be the only way that they found to raise kind of the revenue they need without having too much economic impact. Right, but that is a concern, and you know, inevitably, if the United States ever adopts that, there'll be a great debate about what you can do to it to make it more progressive, and whether you should do that by exempting certain kinds of spending. People talk about food and medicine, or whether instead you might just sort of, instead of doing it on the stuff side, do it on the money side and rebate money to low-income folks in some way to ameliorate some of those concerns.
So the fair tax, I guess, is a form of that, right? But sort of.
I mean, it's consumption
They're going
tax.
to give back rebates. They're going to, you know, give people money ahead of time below a certain income level. Just reminded that I saw them walk around with their shirts on.
So what about a flat tax? Could I hear the professor's thoughts on that? You know, looking at some of the Baltic states in Europe and stuff like that, I know Estonia was one of the first countries in the world to move to a flat tax, and it seemed to work out pretty well for some of these countries. Is there anything that would seem to indicate that the U.S. is different from some of these countries? There are significant differences where a flat tax here would be able to simplify the tax code and raise legitimate revenue.
Right, so that's a good question. So there's one key difference between the United States and the Baltics, or you hear this also invoked with Ireland, which is very successful, had a very low, very flat tax system, which is that small nations can do something that's much harder for the United States, which I'll use the word steal, but I don't mean it in a bad way. But if you're a small country and have a very low tax rate, it's relatively easy to bring in business from kind of your neighbors, whereas it's harder for the United States. And so we have less opportunity to get the kind of kick that some of those countries have had in that front. But I would say, just as you're indicating at the end of your question, right, the key thing to keep in mind whenever you hear people talk about a flat tax, and for those of you who've heard this before, right, it's usually marketed as, there'll be one single flat rate, 20%, and you'll be able to do your income taxes on a postcard. What I emphasize, those are two distinct things, right? One is calculating what your income is, and for any of you who've had the wonderful pleasure of filling out a 1040 form, the hard part of doing your taxes is figuring out what your income is, right? That's why the tax code is this high, right? The actually deciding, figuring out once you figured out your income, right, deciding how much you owe in taxes, right, whether it's one flat rate or the 5, different rates that we have today, right, all of you are fully qualified to do that in under 1 minute, right? That part's really, really easy. And so from a simplification point of view, I think the thing that's very attractive about the flat tax is trying to close all these exemptions and deductions and have a much more simplified notion of what income is, so that it's just much less painful for people to pay their taxes. And then I often joke that, I think in America, ultimately the choice would be, if we wanted to go this route, that we'd ultimately have a flat tax but with multiple rates, which doesn't sound flat, right, because it's got multiple rates. But what you'd be doing is trying at least to simplify the notion of income. And just to give you some geekdom, that's called an X tax. Right? So you can have an X tax and a flat tax that has multiple rates, so you can be progressive but have uneven benefits on the flat tax.
Okay, so now Democrat over here. Oh, you're Republican. Yeah, other side Democrats. Sorry.
So what are the views of the Republicans of raising taxes?
Obviously not a big fan.
Yeah, and why not? I mean, if you're talking to most of the experts, it's going to be really, they're going to say it's going to be a combination. So what would the Republican argument against raising taxes be?
I mean, I think it's very much wishful thinking that, you know, they think that, you know, we can get by by just cutting spending. They don't actually realize the magnitude of our problems.
Yeah.
And so I think the argument against cutting, or the argument against raising taxes rather, is, you know, where are you getting it from? If you look at how many people are already government dependent, how many, and who's paying for those people, I think the question becomes, how much more can we expect from those people? How much more can we actually squeeze them? I have some stats here. This is as of 2004. I don't know if you guys do any work with this organization. It's called the Tax Foundation. It's a very reliable, nonpartisan source. And I guess as of 2004, which was actually before, you know, the video was even made, so it's probably much worse now. 3 out of every 5 households receive more government benefits. They receive more money from the government than they do, you know, putting in the system. And so the question, I think, kind of becomes, you know, where's the equality in the tax code? Where's the sustainability? And just how much can we squeeze, you know, the top echelon of people on there?
And do we have a democratic response to that?
What I would say is that, as you mentioned earlier, it's important to, like, I think it's often forgotten that fiscal conservatism is built like low taxation as well as balanced budgets. I think a really important aspect, and partly this is from around like Canadian perspective as well, is this idea of around the mid-1990s, Canada had been running budget deficits for nearly 30 years. What happened was the Canadian government decided to begin to raise taxation, and then eventually you began to have budget surpluses for a period of around 10 years, which lowered Canada's percentage of the debt to GDP ratio significantly. I think a significant component of any debt reduction measure is increasing taxation, but also making government smarter. So, for instance, things such as healthcare, which the Congressional Budget Office has predicted would lower the federal deficit by $1.2 trillion over 20 years. So I think it's a mixture of both making government smarter as well as looking at all the alternatives on the table and not writing off such items as possibly increasing taxes.
Okay, great. Well, I guess that kind of segues us into entitlement. We talked, this video was a lot about diagnosing the problem and what are the problems. And now I guess we need to start looking at it. What do we need to do? What do we need to reform? You said we just passed healthcare. It's going to save $1.2 trillion over the next 20 years, but we need to save 30, 40 million for the next 60, 70 years. So, what are the real reforms that we need to make? I've heard a lot about tort reform.
Can you speak up, Ryan?
I'm sorry.
Sure.
Yeah, what are the real reforms that we need to be looking at, and what are the realistic, what can you really get through?
I'll start a little bit. I think the big X factor with healthcare reform is we don't know how much the reforms are going to control the growth of healthcare. I think people talk about Social Security being the easier challenge, and it's an easier challenge for a couple of reasons. One, it's just delivering checks, and it's delivering money. So it's a fairly simple, straightforward process. You get money coming in, money going out. There's complicated formulas of figuring how the money goes out, but it's just moving cash around. Whereas when you're actually delivering service, delivering healthcare, that's fundamentally much more complicated. But the other reason why Social Security is easier is that Don or I, you just sit down and give you a list of 20 items and say you can pick and choose among some combination of these 20 items, and you can sort of add them up, and you can figure out how to solve the problem. And they may be some of those choices will be raising retirement age, or slowing the growth of benefits, or having slower COLAs, or maybe subjecting more wages to higher, lifting the wage cap and paying taxes on a higher percentage of your wages. And each of those has political drawbacks, but analytically, they're all pretty straightforward and options where we can say with a relatively good degree of certitude, you do this option, it's going to save this much money, get us that much closer to actual balance. When you come to healthcare, that list doesn't exist. There are some things that economists and health experts think are going to be more effective than others, and so I think the Cadillac tax on high high-cost health insurance plans is something that I think most economists across the board.
Could you explain that a little bit further?
It's,
Cadillac?
yeah, Cadillac, it's basically sort of gets an issue that right now if you get money, your salary through your benefit, your earnings through wages, that's subject to taxes, but you're getting, your employer provides you a health insurance benefit, pays for your health care, that's non-taxable. So that's one of the biggest tax expenditures and biggest subsidies. And so to some extent, the tax code is encouraging people to get more expensive health insurance plans that have they're less efficient, that have more first dollar coverage, and have less responsibility for their payer. So that helps fuel the growth of cost. One of the things that the health care plan did is instead of scaling back that exclusion, which people have talked about for years, it says that health insurance plans that are over a certain cost will now be subject to a 40% tax. By the final bill, delayed the implementation of that until 2018 and put in a lot of a few other caveats and exceptions to it to make it a lot less effective and aggressive than it would have been. But it still is out there, and it now creates a very powerful incentive for these, both for the employers who are looking at plans as well as the insurance companies, to start taking actions to try to hold down costs and make more cost efficiency and making consumers more cost conscious by making the cost of those plans, basically, effectively pricing those plans out of the market, making those plans not viable. So that is something that I think everyone agrees will have an effect. It's hard to know how much. But a lot of what was in the healthcare reform bill was trying to use the market power of Medicare to make a lot of changes and some pilot projects and demonstration projects trying to change the incentives in delivery of care, not as much as we probably could have, but trying to move towards paying more for outcomes than for providing amount of services and moving towards accountable care organizations. And throughout the bill, there are a large number of reforms, many of which the Congressional Budget Office said we can't score savings is. Not that we don't think this could have savings, but there's no real data or evidence or way to know how likely it is to succeed. And so by doing their job properly, CBO isn't going to say this something may or may not get savings. We're going to attribute savings that we're not sure are going to realize. And so a lot of things that have the potential for savings that may or may not work. So I think the real test on healthcare reform, and one of the reforms items in healthcare reform that got very little attention is the Independent Payment Advisory Board, which is a board that will be appointed by the president that will have the power that if Medicare spending is over a certain threshold, to then recommend changes in Medicare payments and Medicare reimbursements and the system in order to bring costs down. And those changes would take effect immediately, will take effect automatically unless Congress actually affirmatively blocked it. So you're sort of taking the fine-tuning of the Medicare program and setting payment rates out of the political process of Congress. Now, whether that's going to be sustainable remains to be seen. But I think the real top challenge on healthcare is we put some reforms in place, started testing some others. There are other things out there that we haven't done yet, but it's a matter of now really evaluating and monitoring what we've done, look at how the programs are working, which ones aren't, and trying to build on that. And hopefully that Medicare will be able to drive for it. I think tort reform is something that has some amount of savings, and that was one of the areas we didn't do.
But that was the big disagreement, I think, between Republicans and Democrats, right? That Republicans really wanted some sort of tort reform. I think it was more like limiting the kind of, what kind of equal for that kind of thing.
I mean, I think there's potential savings there. I do think that tends to get exaggerated on both sides.
So bringing down tort reform, does that not help?
It will. I mean, it will help, but I think
it's small in the scheme of things.
Yeah, the scheme of things is malpractice insurance. Isn't that one of the big drivers for independent, like especially the general care physicians who are sort of being driven out by the high cost of malpractice insurance?
I mean, I think that is one of the drivers, but a lot of it's more the degree of utilization generally that people have who want the best, and that there is the incentives on what care is delivered now is to order more tests and more procedures. So it's not necessarily driven by tort reform. It's that we want, if there's a test that we can have to make sure something, we're going to want to have it. And instead of paying the hospital for the results of, if someone has a hip replacement and getting it done, they pay for all the procedures. And so one of the things you see in healthcare reform is that there's great variations across the country payments without much variation in outcomes. And so one of the things is how do you drive the process of if someone has a heart attack in one part of the country as opposed to another part of the country, that we may spend far more for paying person B and person A for their care, yet they will be no person B, even though we spent far more for their care, is not much better off. And I think that's really the issues that we need to work at.
And I think, something Gravenor said, I mean, that question and that difference, the fact that tort reform isn't the whole piece, it's a piece of the pie, and the different practices of delivering care around the country is just that piece of the pie. I think the troubling thing is, with healthcare in particular, is that there really is no silver bullet to how to fix a problem. In fact, there isn't even a bronze bullet. All you have are lead bullets. And you have to find a way to put all of these pieces together and stitch all of those solutions. And each one comes with a lot of political pushback. You have a lot of opposition, even with something like tort reform. It's just a little piece of the pie, and yet it sparks these huge fights in Congress that ties up the political process. And a lot of these things, health care, very difficult. As we said before, Social Security, much more straightforward. There are clear policy options there. In a lot of these cases, it's not the policy that's the problem. Some of the policies are harder. The problem, though, is the politics. It's how do we get through that sort of knee-jerk reaction. If you say to the Republicans, we need to raise taxes to fix this problem, say, no, we don't have to do that. We're just going to cut all the spending, and then we can cut taxes too. And if you tell the Democrats that we're going to have to put a stop on some of these spending, say, no, we don't have to do that. We can increase our delivery of care and services, and that's going to bring down the cost somehow. And then we're also going to raise the taxes. And so you have these two camps that are just talking right past each other. And so that political problem keeps you from finding a solution.
So, Stephen, you guys at Concord does a lot of outreach. You guys are out in the field talking to a lot of people. And what are you telling the people, or just the people out in the country are saying? Are they working together, Democrat and Republican? How aware are they of what's going on?
I think more than aware, they are wary. They're wary of the political pushbacks. And it always is an eye-opening experience whenever we have this conversation. They say, wow, this is difficult. And they start to realize that they do need to start reaching across the aisle. And a lot of them are frustrated at the political rhetoric, but it's become so ingrained in the way our Congress works, is that they kind of expect it. So our goal, our mission, what we try to do with the public is we tell them that it doesn't have to be this way. With politics, you always have the two extremes. They're the angry ones, and so they yell the most. They make the most noise, and so that's all you hear. So for Congress supporters, the people that we talk to, the communities we work with, we try to encourage them. If you are in the center and you have the understanding that this has to be a bipartisan solution, that everyone has to make sacrifices, be the noisy center. Speak up and say that we want the compromise to be the tone of the Congress.
And just to echo a lot of what Stephen said, both from my former Concord hat and not from where I sit now, that when politicians look at it, it's easy to blame politicians are out of touch and they're causing all the problems, but really Congress is a representative body in many ways, the truest sense of the word, and they are representing what they are hearing and what their incentives are to get reelected. And so it's very important for them to hear their voices. I spent much of the last couple of days editing documents talking about how much Democrats have cut taxes, because every Democratic member of Congress is terrified that they'll be accused of being a tax raiser, and so all their political advisors are saying, you need to be telling everyone, all of your constituents, how much you've cut taxes in the last 2 years. Meanwhile, they're for all the spending. And conversely, one of the most disappointing things in the healthcare debate for me was you had a lot of Republicans in Congress who have talked about the need for entitlement reform and spending control, yet seeing the opportunity to use the Medicare savings in healthcare reform as something to attack. And something as basic as comparative effectiveness of let's see which treatments are more effective than others suddenly became, which seems like a pretty common sense responsible thing to do. The federal government is spending several $100 billion a year on health insurance. We ought to know which ones have coverage and which ones are more effective than others. Was then attacked as rationing care and sort of part of the basis for the death panel rhetoric. And so you have both sides, Republicans who should be for spending, see the political opportunity of trying to say the Democrats are trying to cut spending. And meanwhile, you have Democrats who are for all the spending and therefore should be, therefore have to support the taxes or feel compelled to talk about cutting taxes. But they're doing that because that's what gets them reelected. That's what motivates voters. that's what the political consultants. And so that's why I'm glad to have forums like this and Concord Coalition and other groups that are trying to particularly bring in younger voters into the process are very key, because it's very hard, very difficult for politicians to make the tough choices that are necessary until they are going to have the support from their constituents to do so. That if the lesson of every politician is that you make tough choices, you get defeated, then we're never going to deal with the deficit. And unfortunately, far too often, that is what members of Congress hear.
Completely agree. I happen to think that, and you mentioned that Congress is representative of the American people. I happen to think it's almost too representative of the American people, because we really don't have, the politicians that are willing to really have a gut check, to step up to the plate, make the hard decisions, to stop talking to the American people kind of in a paternalistic sense, or promising fiscal fantasies when there isn't anything there. So it seems strange to me that, and it's the case on both sides of the aisle too. There are some good members of Congress, but on the whole, I don't think that most members of Congress are really willing to step up and make the tough decisions, even if it means that they're not a congressperson come November when that election comes around. And it's just sad that we have a lack of people who Plato or Edmund Burke would dare to call statesmen.
Yeah, I actually was just talking to Ken Conrad today, who's the chairman of the Budget Committee, Senate Budget Committee, and I said, what are the chances of getting meaningful reform passed soon? He said, not very good. So, I don't know how that makes me feel with that. It's kind of, to hear him say that, and he's been working really hard on it. He said, we're just not, it's not going to happen the first time, that's for sure. I think their first trial was at the Fiscal Commission they originally tried to establish. So, I guess let's move on here. I want to talk about future investments, where we should be investing our money, because as young Americans we see a lot of spending going on, and it's primarily a spending problem, but we still have to spend somewhere, right? We still got to make those investments that are going to create jobs and create a tax base for the future for us to pay off what we already owe. So I'd like to just make a comment on where do you think we should be spending our money? What should we be investing in now so we have jobs and we're competitive and we can increase revenues in the future? So how do you want to start?
Well, sure. Card-carrying economist, right? So the first thing I have to say is that most of the job creation, except for you aspire to, will of course be done by folks in the private sector. But one of the things the government can spend money on to assist that, right? The usual argument for the government to step in are things where the private sector isn't going to do it. Right? So that's an argument for supporting basic research, which I'm sitting at a university here. I work for a university, so that's maybe biased. But so supporting basic research, supporting education, making sure you have kind of the core things you need, and some infrastructure investments. The important thing to keep in mind, this was on one of the charts you saw in the previous movie, is everything I just described, and even if the folks on the panel here want to multiply it by 5, is still a relatively small portion of what the federal government actually spends money on. Right. So the action is in Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, national defense. Your mental model of the federal government should be it's the world's largest insurance company with a subsidiary that does wars in defense, and then has these very little tiny subsidiaries that do this other stuff. So it's not where enormous amounts of money are, but right, kind of intelligent use of it are things that we can definitely use to improve economic performance. But then then I would expand that beyond spending, and I would say there are also things we're worried about growing the economy and having a more robust economy in the future in a way which will just be good in its own terms and helpful with the fiscal situation. There are other things you can think about, like more intelligent immigration policy. I think there are a lot of arguments to be made that having more high-skilled immigrants into the United States would be beneficial for the economy and for our budget balance. And we ought to think about those things as well.
First, to piggyback on part of what Don said is that one of the reasons to talk about entitlement reform isn't just for the fiscal responsibility and for the deficit, but if you just look at the budget, a greater and greater share of the revenues we have coming in are going to the Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, interest on the debt, and virtually everything that we talk about as investments or government generally is in the small slice of spending called discretionary spending, which is, as you saw in the charts, being squeezed. And so, I think places such as education and basic research, and I think to some extent infrastructure as well is another place I'm not one of those people who believes that infrastructure provides the great, as much of the bang for the buck as members of Congress do. But clearly, having a good infrastructure to be able to move goods and people across the country is an important part of that as well. But I think sort of going back to the broader theme of the need for entitlement reform, and for explaining, is that the more money is going for those needs and for who's being consumed by entitlements, you're going to be squeezing that pot of money that's available for those choices, and you're also squeezing the pot of money that is available to respond to future emergencies, whether it be another Katrina or an economic collapse or other needs. That we're always going to have things, you're budgeting for things, but you're always having things that are coming unexpected, and that the more your budget is locked in with entitlements where you have very little flexibility, the less room you have to be responding to emergencies. I think that's, frankly, part of the reason that we were in the trouble, we're in the situation we are today, that when we were hit with the financial crisis and all the recession and all the costs that came, that we already were starting from a deficit, and so this was building on top of it. You really should be in a situation where you're having balance when these crises can arrive. You have a surplus to work from, but I think generally we won't be able to make investments, and I think to some extent investments have been squeezed over the last couple of decades because of the growth of entitlement spending has been there.
And clean energy, what about that? I mean, that's been a big push for China and India. China's going after that. I mean, that's the next big market for it.
Yes, and that's one place where you get closer. As economists talk about how much the government should be involved, because clearly the green economy is going to have be producing benefits, and so there is an incentive of the private sector to be getting in and making those investments. And so the question is, how much does the government need to be getting in to try to encourage those investments before they're really going to be profitable in order to push it forward? I think there's less of an argument for government support of that than there is for basic research, where there isn't any real direct relation to profits. And so the question more is that a lot of the investments you'll see, in whether it be wind energy or some of the other green energy, may have very large upfront costs and we're not yet fully profitable, and so the government is supporting that. But I think that's also something that hopefully the U.S. economy and entrepreneurship on its own will take on.
Well, and particularly on its own, helped by a carbon tax or a trade alternative system or something, which, I mean, is, in essence, creates a large incentive to innovate and come up with green tech. And which is not to say there might not be opportunities for the federal government to finance projects that make sense, but you know, the reality is that the energy system is an incredibly large, complex system, and that many of the things we want to do to be clean tech are going to be things that are not obvious from the perspective of anyone sitting in an office in Washington, D.C., but will only be discovered once people have a large price incentive to go out and think about them. And while it is true that we need some major breakthroughs if we believe climate change is a significant problem, there are dozens or hundreds or thousands of other changes we need out there to address it. They're only going to be found if people have a price signal to go find it.
I have a question for some of the experts, just in terms of like Social Security, as we've discussed a lot, and reforming Social Security. I believe back in 2005, President Bush proposed privatizing aspects of Social Security. I guess my first question is like, do you think that this is like a feasible way to reduce the American deficit in the long term? What is entailed necessarily under like privatizing Social Security?
Right. So President Bush proposed basically two things. One of which, what would you say, about 95% of the attention, right? 97% of the attention, which was the accounts, which was, I mean, the administration's doing. The accounts to first order have no effect on the long-run fiscal situation. Expert will notice. They actually make it slightly worse because of a variety of smaller features like their inheritability that I won't torment you with. But the accounts were intended, well, I got to give the accounts their credit for one thing. There's a good argument that if you created individual accounts that money would go into in Social Security, the one thing it might help would be with the political economics of how we run our budget, because it would make apparent today that the surpluses we used to run in Social Security, we're not running one this year, but that the surpluses we used to run in Social Security had all been in essence earmarked for future benefits. So one benefit of an account structure is basically what Al Gore talked about as a lockbox. It's just a lockbox structured by accounts, where you'd be taking some of the money, putting it in an account with people's names on it, and it would be very harder, as Dave Walker talked about, to the government to actually spend it. But if you leave aside the political economy concern, first order effect of accounts is to do nothing on solvency. The reality is it makes it slightly worse. Yeah, the other thing, the 5% part, at least in terms of the media attention it got, was to make changes to the benefit structure of Social Security and possibly do something on the revenue side. And those are the levers you got to pull on if you actually want to address the problem.
Yeah, and I would just piggyback on that. There was, President Bush did endorse a concept known as progressive price indexing, which is sort of a wonky term for a convoluted process that basically says that the rate of return you're going to get on the replacement rate you're going to get when you retire is going to be lower the higher income you were. So if you were someone who was making $20,000 a year, Social Security would be replacing a very large percentage of that income. It's already that way. It's already a progressive system in that matter. That the higher you go up in the income scale, the greater amounts, the less of the amount of replacement is going to be made by Social Security. And progressive price indexing was a way to enhance that considerably more. So the lowest income workers, their benefits would continue to grow with wages over time, and the higher up you went, they would be only growing with prices, which aren't growing as fast. Which is a long way of saying that they were looking at ways of trying to provide significant savings in Social Security, reducing the amount of money that Social Security is going to have to spend over time, but doing so in a way that's more progressive, and I think to some extent in conjunction with the individual accounts, is that the higher income workers would be more likely to be able to benefit from the individual accounts and afford to take greater risk with the accounts, and they'd be getting less from their Social Security. The lower income workers who would probably be more conservative investments would have a greater replacement rate in their Social Security benefits. But I think you have to look at either some type of changes in the benefit formula like that, or you could look at changing the retirement eligibility age, both the early eligibility age and the normal retirement age. You can also look at the cost of living adjustments, and there's economic evidence that the measure for inflation used for cost of living adjustments might overstate inflation. You could look at that. There's a few other basic levers you have in there, and then you can look at either raising the payroll tax rate, which tends to be not as popular, but the other version has been subjecting a greater percentage of wages, amount of wages to income. Right now, I believe the cap is just under $112,000 of wages, and you don't pay any FICA tax on wages above that amount. So people have talked about raising that amount by some the threshold by some amount. And I think in terms of the question on Republicans on taxes, I think on Social Security, the argument I've always made that some Republicans find persuasive is if in exchange for having a higher, somewhat more greater amount of payroll taxes, whether for raising the cap or the rates, you have much greater certainty in Social Security, and by restraining benefits costs, that you are preventing a much greater tax increase down the road. Essentially, you can look at Social Security and say, here's what the costs are, and the cost as a percentage of payroll are continuing to grow, and that cost line keeps going up. That is effectively taxes. It's going to be reflected at some point. We can either do it now or later. And the further along you go on, the harder it is to get the savings and benefits, because whenever you make changes in Social Security on benefits, you want to phase those in gradually to give people time to plan for it. It's somewhat unfair to tell someone at age 58 you've been making plans on what your retirement is going to be, and suddenly it's going to be dramatically different from what you were counting on. So you want to phase that in. So it takes, if you're dealing with Social Security on the benefit side, it takes some time to achieve savings. Whereas if you raise the payroll tax, or you subject a greater amount of income to taxes, that money comes in right away. Every year we wait, the more attractive things to get money immediately on the tax side becomes, and the harder it is to rely entirely on spending. And so when I first started working on Social Security plans in the mid-90s, it was relatively easy, analytically at least, to have a put together plan entirely with spending restraints, do those spending changes benefit changes where nothing affected anyone over age 55, and you could have a plan that was getting back in balance before the system started facing shortfalls. Now we're having waited now over a decade. I've never worked on Social Security way too long, I guess. We've already now the surpluses that were used to be way off in the, we're going to continue into long into the future are now diminishing. We'll have surpluses again for a few years. Hopefully it kind of picks up, but even if the economy picks up, we'll be back in the system running deficits on an annual basis in a few years. And so now it's virtually impossible to put together a plan that's going to put Social Security on a good cash flow basis going forward without some degree of revenues, and it's also very hard to do a Social Security plan in which you don't affect benefits for anyone approaching retirement, because we're just so far into the process where the baby boom retirement is already beginning. the cash crunch is now really upon us. And so I think one of the arguments for Republicans is that the sooner we get a deal, that even if it has to have put some taxes into the process now, if that deal involves restraints and benefits down the road, that's going to avoid a much greater tax increase in the future.
Social Security this year would pay out more than takes in.
Yes.
And that wasn't ready to happen until 2016.
Yeah, they bounced around,
Yeah.
And that hopefully it's a temporary blip that will go back and circle some companies if the economy recovers. But even if it does, we will be back into deficits in a few years. Even if the economy is going gangbusters, and that's actually on the soapbox here. There's some talk about how people have said the Social Security crisis is overstated because the economic projections of the future are way too pessimistic and just assumes more reasonable economic assumptions that the problem will go away. There's a lot of technical reasons which I was more qualified to explain than I am why the economic assumptions going forward are more reasonable. They should be lower than historical practices. But even if you assume that economic growth is much higher than the projections always account for, Social Security benefits grow with wages. And so if the economy started growing substantially faster, that the amount of Social Security benefits people would be accruing would be growing substantially faster. So you get some benefit to the Social Security system from stronger economic growth, and you see some negatives from weaker. But it's on an overall basis, it is far from a cure-all that will solve a very, very small part of it because it will bring in more revenues, but the large percentage of the increased revenues coming in will then ultimately be reflected in higher spending. So higher economic growth is definitely not going to solve the problems with Social Security.
Anything that?
I mean, I don't. I certainly can't have anything to these gentlemen when it comes to
I think briefly bring this up, and I don't know how long we can talk about it because it's a pretty straightforward subject, but interest. Yeah, in 2020, interest is projected to be $916 billion. So that's more than double what the U.S. spent on all non-defense discretionary programs last year. I think this projection is at the current bond rates right now, right? The current yield for bond. So I don't know if anyone believes that it's actually going to stay the same, or are we going to be, are China and other countries going to be demanding more higher yields in the bond as we take that up? So I don't know what's coming on that.
Well, I was just saying, so the projections you're talking about, right, so we built up a large debt, right, and we have to pay interest on that, which is a nuisance, but is reality. And it's actually helpful because we pay interest on it, means we get to go another year without having to pay off the whole debt. So the projections you're talking about do in fact have interest rates rising. So we've gone through this period during which the economy's been incredibly weak. The Fed has cut interest rates. The world economy has been weak. And so it was an interesting, weird budget fact. Actually, in 2009, which is when the budget started, we started running $1 trillion deficits and things got out of control. We actually spent less on interest in 2009 than in 2008 because interest rates just fell off a cliff. And so the 10-year projections basically have these two things driving interest up, which is first, debt keeps growing and compounding, and then second, interest rates go back to what analysts think of as being a more normal level. And so that starts eating up more and more of the budget, which makes our life more and more difficult. There's basically this compounding problem that once the debt's large enough, the interest grows on it rapidly, and you've got to do something about that if you're going to prevent the debt from running away faster than the economy. And then there's the concern you raised, which is, okay, that's assuming things go back to normal. At some point on the fiscal trajectory we're on, the world doesn't let us be normal. Right? For those of you who are watching what's happening in Greece, right? Greece went through a period which it wasn't that fiscally responsible. Things were normal, and then one day the world decided things weren't normal anymore, and all of a sudden its interest rates that they face have skyrocketed. And if we stay on our trajectory, that will happen to the United States one day. If you ask me to tell you what day, I will tell you it will be a Wednesday. But I have no idea when. And I don't really know if
any idea what the rate can go to. I mean, what is historical averages, and what do we think those are demanding? Do we have does anyone know?
No, there's some folks who are trying to figure this out and kind of do scenarios of what it looks like. I like to view the world as that we will solve this problem before we get to learn the answer to this question.
So we'll solve this before 2020.
So or at least solve is a strong word, right? Solve, solve in a period that covers a prolonged period. You know, back in the Clinton years, James Carville, who was one of President Clinton's advisors, had this great quote that when he died, he wanted to come back reincarnated as the bond market. And it was because at the time everyone was afraid of the bond market, because it's as though the bond market is basically voting on your policies every day. And if interest rates go up, that means that the bond market doesn't like your policies. At least some of the time. Sometimes it means the reverse, but that's the bond market. And so that, you know, we will go through, I hope, that stage where it's not that we wake up one morning and interest rates have gone up by a factor of, 2, but that over time, if we don't get our act together sufficiently quickly, the bond market will begin to penalize us somewhat. And then there will be the second coming of Ross Perot, and then we'll solve this.
I would say, first of all, I'm just playing as an academic, would not want to have the empirical evidence to be able to test the theory, so we want this to happen, so now you can set back perspective and have hard data to work from.
That's what Greece and California and Illinois are for.
Okay. But I will tell you that if you talk to the various economists within the Obama administration, I think there's a much greater nervousness on the part, not necessarily we're at the true hard landing crisis point, but that's that they're getting much more nervous about the signals they're getting from the bond market and from international investors. And I'll just give you a little bit of inside baseball. That there was an article in the Washington Post earlier this week that was administration officials leaking that the budget deficit may be lower than previously expected. It turns out that leak came from people in the Treasury Department who have been talking to international investors, and so it was kind of a little bit premature for them getting out, making that leak, but that. I don't know this for a fact, but the most logical theory of why they put that leak out is that they started hearing international investors getting nervous, and so they wanted to get some buzz out there saying that no, it's actually our deficit is going to be less than it's going to be, trying to provide some reassurance. That a year ago, if you talk to the economists, they would say we can afford to be running these deficits because interest rates are so low, we're borrowing money cheaply, and that since no one else in the economy is able to put money in there and borrow it, that essentially the federal government is going to borrow money cheaply and inject it into the economy since no one else is putting money in there. And they're saying, but we can afford to do that. Now, there's definitely a much greater degree of nervousness about the vulnerability we have. And then, fundamentally, the problem of interest is that it is, by definition, the most wasteful spending in the federal budget. It's something we are legally obligated to do. Obviously, if we didn't pay the interest, the consequences would be really dire, completely destroying the creditworthiness of the federal government, and interest rates would completely skyrocket. But other than avoiding that calamity of government defaulting on our debt, money spent in interest of debt doesn't educate one person, doesn't pay one doctor, doesn't get us anything results. And because a greater percentage of our debt is being held by foreign investors, you can also look at interest on the debt as our greatest foreign aid program, that we're essentially taking revenues collected here and then sending it overseas in payments to international investors. Now, don't want to go too much because we definitely appreciate the international investors. And part of the reason why interest rates have stayed so low is that with everything going on, investors around the world still see the United States in dollars as the safest place to put their money and putting the money there. So we are able to have a pretty large pool of money from which to borrow. So we want to have that, but it does mean that we're all paying taxes, and part of the money we're paying in taxes is now being sent overseas. And not even being sent overseas to accomplish any foreign policy or military goal, but simply just to be keeping international investors willing to continue lending us money.
And does that give us less power? You hear a lot of talk about how China finances so much of our debt that Obama can't be as tough as he don't want to be, or is that just talk?
Here's thoughts. I mean, my sense is that there's a little bit of that, but I think it is vastly overstated. And the other part of it is that we're sort of all tied together, that even if the Chinese had political reasons to try to withdraw all the money and stop lending money to it, they're holding so much of our treasury bills and holding so much of our debt that if they would lose as well, and that their economy, and they're also relying on the U.S. economy for so much of their exports and for their GDP, that we're tied together, and so they would end up shooting themselves in the process of trying to undercut us. And so I think there's a little bit, obviously, in the political dynamics that are there, but it's hard to see the traditional sense of the Chinese saying, well, we're your banker, and so we're not going to, if you don't give us, you sell something to Taiwan, we're not going to lend you money. I don't think they're really able to exercise that threat too credibly.
I think it's going to be on Iran policy that we really find out whether that hypothesis is true or not. I mean, I think this is President Obama's biggest test, foreign policy-wise, in this term. and he just got Hu Jintao on board the other day at the Nuclear Summit, to at least sit down and discuss sanctions. From before he was saying, we're not really interested, it's not really in our interest to do that, so we'll kind of see how the whole debt crisis plays out with foreign policy on Iran. How much help China is willing to lend us versus how much they'd rather go to the other side.
Great. Well, are we about out of time here?
Yeah, you want to ask one last question? Or anyone, yeah, do you want to open it up and anyone?
Yeah, we can open it up to any questions, that if anybody has any questions that we haven't answered yet. I guess my last question is, maybe it's a larger question, it's taking longer than the last question, but what if we do nothing? What happens if we do nothing? Let's say we just let debt, whatever. We're not going to do anything. And what does the world look like in 2020?
Well, first of all, the government is doing virtually nothing other than writing checks for retirement programs, paying healthcare bills for seniors and poor people, and paying interest in our debt. And once you do that by 2020, I believe that just those three things would be consuming, if not all, virtually all of our tax revenues. And so anything else we would do beyond basically Social Security, Medicare, and interest on the debt would be coming with borrowed money. So that's number one, what would be happening if we do nothing. Number two is then we would have very little flexibility to respond to a future crisis, and so any future recession would likely be deeper because policymakers would be much more reluctant to take quick action on the type of fiscal stimulus that would be necessary to respond to an economy. And we already had some of that, but we've been somewhat more tepid in some of our responses because of the deficits, including that was, we haven't done anything about the deficits. Face a similar crisis 10 years from now, policymakers are far more likely to refrain from taking the steps necessary to keep the recession from getting worse. And so that's another very real danger. It's as much a political danger as an economic danger, that the political psychology of large deficits would restrain political action to respond to crises. And then obviously the third point is at some point it is going to be creating a crisis in which we're not able to finance our debt without paying a tremendous premium, and that will then create a tremendous spiral in for our economy.
Yes, I don't think we can literally get to 2020 without doing something. The bond market would punish us. The programs would have a hard time operating. I think the other thing, if we put off acting, the other thing we give up, though, is that, some of the changes that are going to be required are going to, result in some people getting less in benefits than they currently anticipate, right, or is currently built into law. Right? So if you talk about solving Social Security, and part of that being bringing down the growth benefits in the future, right, that's going to disadvantage some folks. And it would be far better if we wanted to do that we do it in advance, so that people have an opportunity to adjust and plan ahead for it. Right? It's much better to, cut the future growth and benefit of someone like me who's got 20 or 30 years of working ahead of them, rather than someone who's 60. And same for Medicare. And so the longer you wait, you either are restraining the group of folks who you can ask to help address this problem, or you're putting yourself in a situation where you're going to surprise some folks who thought that they were going to have these benefits and weren't able to plan accordingly.
Although I'm the political science major, not the economist, I will give one of the most basic rules of economics that apply to fiscal policy to sample that point. It's Stein's law from Herb Stein, former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, that if something can't go on forever, it tends to stop. And I think that's probably the best description of our fiscal policy. It can't go on forever, and so it will stop at some point. And exactly what causes it to do so, we don't know, but that clearly what we're doing isn't sustainable, and it can't continue without, and something happening in the next 10 years.
Well, the concerted political effort of the
I think that's.
So do you guys people just rise up and slash?
So yes, all of you should be slashed. Should leave this meeting, go march on the Capitol.